If you're like most Americans, you live near a big city. Once the envy of the world, setting records for the height of their skyscrapers and showcasing some of the most stunning architectural wonders of art deco design in places like New York and Chicago. Starting the Depression, American cities began a marked decline. Following the war, efforts to clear out urban blight were made through a series of social and civil engineering projects designed to move entire ethnic white communities out of the city centers, mixing them with black populations and creating an entirely new infrastructure designed around the suburbs, outlying the city, and all connected by the automobile and the newly created interstate highway system. The economic boom of the 1950s was spurred on by this massive infrastructure redevelopment. But as the tumult of the 1960s, the Vietnam War, and oil shocks of the 1970s exposed the vulnerabilities of these newly created megalopolises, people began to question these soulless commutes on the highway and the vast time, energy, and monetary expenditure necessary to keep the system going. Like the hippie movements of the 1970s, where people went off to live in small communal farms away from the chaos of the modern city. After the 2008 financial crisis, millennials are increasingly turning to solutions like tiny houses to try to scrape by some semblance of what they had growing up in the suburbs, in which they can no longer afford to live. The shape and character of the American dream is surely defined by its people, but when the majority of them cannot afford to live in these vastly expensive and globalizing cities, yet cannot find work outside of them, the prospects for the ordinary American begin to look uncertain, as does the stability of the system itself.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a
на полный разгон гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
All right, welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we have a very special guest, Dark Enlightenment. He is an infrastructure enthusiast, and he's been interviewed by Ryan Landry in the past to talk about our great cities of America, what is good and bad about them. And Dark, why don't you give us a little background on what you want to talk about today?
So I want to say thank you to you guys for having me on the show. I've listened to almost every episode. I'm catching up right now, and I've really enjoyed it. I really think that the format of the show of exposing the different lies that we've been sold in the 20th century is a valuable service, and my particular expertise is why the so-called American dream of a house in the burbs and 2.5 kids and other stuff just doesn't work out very well in practical terms. And so I reached out to you guys to see if you wanted to talk about it. And that's what we're here to talk about today, is kind of how the idea of a house in the burbs with a yard and a car and 2.5 kids kind of came about, what forces gave rise to it, and why it's a myth.
Yeah, so we're glad
when
to have
did
you.
it first come about?
Okay, well, so we got to back up a little bit and cue the Vivaldi if you want. I got get a little bit Spurgeon. I apologize to the audience for having to be a little bit boring here, but as with most things in America, it has to do with race, the intersectionality of race and immigration and social policy. And America's great cities are where they're at for a reason. Most of the big cities that we think of as terrible, blighted messes like Philadelphia, Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago are actually in really great places to have a city. Chicago is, right there on the closest point between the Mississippi River drainage and the Great Lakes. And Detroit is right on the Detroit River between two of the Great Lakes, and near all this, it's a great spot for a city and for manufacturing, all that kind of stuff. Philadelphia is right there on the Delaware River. It's there for a reason. And when they were originally laid out, if you're really interested in this kind of stuff, I would recommend Christopher Alexander, A Timeless Way of Building is a good book to kind of explain how and why all these cities are laid out the way they are. They're usually a grid pattern, relatively short blocks, civic buildings in the center of town, that kind of thing. And when you think of old Philadelphia with the street ending and a beautiful city hall and that kind of thing, or in New York City, right? The way those are laid out, that actually works really well, versus the highway, collector road, suburbs, winding roads that don't really go anywhere, very confusing, kind of suburb thing that is completely car dependent. So you could live in Chicago or Philadelphia or New York or Boston and not have a car. So the rise of these car-based burbs goes back to approximately the First World War. The first suburbs that existed were mostly rail-based, and the perfect example of that is the suburb of Chicago, Riverside, Illinois. There's a pretty good PBS show, 10 Cities That Changed America. Kind of gives everyone a real brief introduction to this stuff. And the first burbs were on rail lines, on trolley lines. And the idea was that men who worked in factories but didn't want to live next to the city and all the dust and the grime of the Industrial Revolution could take a train, 20 minutes and be in this green and pleasant garden space. But
so
yes,
you almost have this like contrast between kind of what you might call instrumental layout or geography, where like on the East Coast, you'll have a town that exists like on a river or like by some power source or whatever. And then you have this transition to instead of things being there because of the context of their environment, they're kind of just declared. Like you have a town literally because like that was an okay place for two railroads to cross and it was in the middle of nowhere. Or later you have towns exist purely for regulatory purposes. Like this is where the city limit is and we're sure as hell not going to be subject to their jurisdiction. So we're going to be immediately outside of that.
Yeah, and those are, we'll get into those later, but what you had, and all of our great cities are, to a certain extent, based on some kind of instrumentality. Seattle is, Puget Sound. San Francisco is on the greatest natural harbor in the history of the world. Portland is on the confluence of the Columbia and the Willamette. That all of these places, even in the West Coast, are based in some kind of instrumentality. But the difference between West Coast city and East Coast city is that the amount of the city that was based on that instrumentality differs vastly because of all the post-war car-based development. So what happened is after the First World War, the first great migration of blacks up from the South, they were needed in the industrial jobs, and they were the only untapped labor pool. All the white men were off fighting in the war, and they needed somebody to man the machines. And so all these black sharecroppers came up from Mississippi and from the Delta in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, to the industrial cities of the North, and promptly did what they do. Excuse me. And made things worse for everybody. And they were kept from ruining these places by legal discrimination, as well as some strong cultural practices that kept people out. So restrictive covenants were legal up until 1948, which meant that like you can't sell this house to a black person.
There was just like a general culture too. Like the local Lithuanian Catholic neighborhood was never, psyched about a group of blacks moving in and potentially causing problems. Like, assuming they didn't run them immediately out of town just through threats, there was an implicit rule of law. Like, no, we're not going to call the cops. We're just going to come over and put you in line ourselves. We're not interested in any police action here.
Right. And and it was essentially an ethnic conflict between recent immigrants and recent, people in immigrants to the United States and immigrants to the area.
Yeah.
And neither one of them really had much trust in the official establishment. And the official establishment kind of looked the other way up until after World War II.
Do you want to talk about this Shelley versus Kramer ruling where the restrictive covenants you mentioned were found illegal?
Sure, yeah.
That was in 1948, as you said.
So I talked about this briefly on Ryan Landry's show, and Paul Kersey has done a bunch of work on this stuff at SBPDL. But to read briefly from the Wikipedia page, in 1945, an African-American family by the name of Shelley purchased a house in St. Louis, Missouri. At the time of purchase, they were unaware that a restrictive covenant had been in place on the property since 1911. The restrictive covenant prevented, quote, people of Negro and Mongolian race from occupying the property. Lewis Kramer, who lived 10 blocks away, sued to prevent the Shelley home from gaining possessions of the property. The Supreme Court of Missouri held that the covenant was enforceable against the purchasers because the covenant was purely a private agreement between the original parties. As such, it ran with the land and was enforceable against subsequent owners. Moreover, since it ran in favor of an estate rather than purely a person, it could be enforced against a third party. A materially similar scenario occurred in a companion case, McGee v. Sipes from Detroit, Michigan, where the McGees purchased a land that was subject to similar restrictive covenant. So this wasn't just a Southern thing. Like, that's the, you Jim Crow Southern racists. So Missouri might be, St. Louis might be considered South. Detroit certainly isn't. And these restrictive covenants were all over the place. And in fact, in previous developments that they actually built walls between the black neighborhood and the white neighborhood in order to, in the history of the burbs. So this de facto segregation held up until the late 40s. Because being pro-segregation is pro-Hitler or something, as Vider puts it.
Why is it not illegal, or why is it not legal to not want to live near somebody? I don't understand what's illegal about that.
The logic of the case was pretty twisted because, it's a completely symmetrical. You could have agreements to restrict white people from moving into black neighborhoods. It's facially neutral as any race-based classification between two private parties can be. Their rationale was that making these distinctions is icky, and there's kind of a broader. They didn't use the expression social justice, but that was essentially the substance of their holding, that it in some sense reinforced existing discrimination, and so they didn't actually ban. You can still put whatever covenant you want in your contract. It's just that the courts are going to refuse to enforce any of those.
It's an obstacle to social engineering,
right? Yeah. And that was the problem that they had is that these restrictive covenants effectively allowed communities to build up solidarity and property value.
There's a interesting side note. The Solicitor General of the U.S. filed a brief, which is fairly rare, that noted it as sort of the government has an official position on which way this should come out. It was written by 4 lawyers, Mr. Philip Ellman, Oscar Davis, Hilbert Zarkey, and Stanley Silverberg. But interestingly enough, their name wasn't on the brief that was filed because the Deputy Solicitor General, Arnold Raum, said it was bad enough that Solicitor General Perlman's name has to be on there to have one Jew's name on it, but you also have to put these 4 other Jewish names on. It makes it look as if a bunch of Jewish lawyers in the Department of Justice put this out.
Every damn time.
Yeah, those would be bad optics. We wouldn't want that now, would we?
Oh, I'm sorry, guys. I'm just like, I know this stuff, but like every damn time, every rock you want to turn, you're gonna find a noseberg underneath it. So what happens is and the book to read about this stuff, guys, it's a doorstopper, but it's a great book. Is Slaughter of Cities, or The Slaughter of Cities by E. Michael Jones. And I know you guys have talked about his work before.
He's fantastic. If anybody just wants to listen to him speak, he's an excellent orator. He explains things very clearly, and he has a very nice narrative and structure to all of it. So lots of good YouTube videos I'd recommend.
Good bow tie, too.
Yes. He knows how to rock a bow tie. So
even if you, really quickly, even if you do not want to read all of Slaughter of the Cities, which is, it's a good idea too, but there are, if you just type in like EMJ Slaughter of the Cities on YouTube, you'll see several recorded videos of him giving interviews where he kind of overlays the whole subject fairly well. So.
Right. And I haven't found a better narrative of like what really, there are, histories of the suburbs that are put out by lefties and, Jane Jacobs, who incidentally in her famous book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities, the first person she thanks is Saul Alinsky. So this should tell you something.
Yeah, the individual who I believe thanked Satan in the opening pages of his book.
That's correct. So
not just thanked, but dedicated the book to him.
Right. So Hank, you had a quote. Did you want to read?
Oh, that was the quote.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, so yes. So what happened is you had, as Jones details in his book, and you can find kind of things on YouTube that are out there to kind of explain it, that the ethnic solidarity of the Catholic or Greek Orthodox non-WASP white people was a problem because they kept having kids, and these WASPs decided contraception was awesome in 1930 at the Lambeth Conference, so they stopped having kids. And these leftist types that found that sort of, having 6 kids and living in a row house icky, still, couldn't get themselves over like, well, we're the WASPs and democracy is just not on. We are not going to be ruled by a bunch of Roman Catholics. This is absurd. So they still had to preserve my democracy. But they had to.
There was like this general implicit understanding that like WASPs were going to rule and Catholics are just going to kind of get along. But it started to unravel, in my opinion, when, as you're saying, the WASPs stopped having a lot of kids. And they started entering this like early decadent pre-decline stage, which is, ironically what happens to most elite classes. It's certainly what happened to the Roman patricians. It happened to a lot of the Greek aristocrats. It's happened throughout the Middle Ages and even into Enlightenment Europe. Like eventually your ruling class decays if it doesn't take care of itself. So they really didn't know how to, they clearly saw their decline. They just didn't really know how to handle it by improving themselves, and thus unfolds the slaughter of the ethnic blocks.
Right. And actually, I mean, Nick's on tonight. The CIA, or the Office of Wartime Information, was spying on these ethnic communities in America. So we had people connected with the OSS spying on American ethnic communities because, they might be full of German subversives or Italian subversives, or there might be Polish fascist sympathizers in Poletown in Chicago or what have you. And this ethnic solidarity, because they didn't really view themselves as white guys. You know, they weren't white. They were Polish or Armenian or Hungarian or Czech or what have you. They had a national identity and a religious identity, but they didn't have this general notion of white. So the carrot was the Federal Housing Authority veterans loans after the war, low interest rates, low 30-year mortgages at like 4% or something absurd like that. And the stick was the huge influx of blacks that came into the cities, all of the big cities, and were, bursting at the seams in their neighborhoods. And after 1948, there was no way to legally defend yourself. And in Jones talks about this. What was it, Berman v. Parker?
Yes, 1954.
1954, and then of course the famous Brown versus Board of Education of that same year. Berman v. Parker is the Supreme Court decision that allows public purposes to be used, or for housing to be destroyed, or for property to be taken for public purposes, not direct public. So that's kind of the direct precursor to the rather famous case of about a decade ago, Kelo versus New London. Yeah. So anyway, Berman v. Parker lets Robert Moses, the man who built most of New York's highways, just bulldoze Catholic neighborhoods because we need a highway here. And so when your neighborhood's getting cut in half, or you're getting and then you've got this great deal, you can head out to Levittown and avoid the diversity element. But as a consequence of that, if you're in Levittown, right, and you're Irish, and a guy across the street's Italian, and your neighbor on one side is a WASP, and the guy on the other side is German, the only thing you really have in common is just a generic whiteness. And one of the things that did is not only did it destroy the ethnic solidarity that people had formerly had in the neighborhood. There's actually a pretty decent scene in The Sopranos where Tony's chewing his kid out, like, well, we still go to church here because your grandfather built this church. And but it shows that, like, this son and grandson, like, they don't have any connection to this place anymore. And
I believe AJ was asking him, well, why don't we go to church anymore? And Tony didn't answer, but he had brought him to that neighborhood to show him sort of what the, I guess, immigrant Italian families had built, in spite of what everybody sort of around them were thinking they were capable of. They built this church on their own. And there was obviously a lot of solidarity in that community at that time. And as they were driving back home, they go through basically what had become essentially a series of crack houses that were populated by black people. And there was a couple of exchanges they had there, which were also quite good if you haven't seen those episodes. But it just shows what happened to these neighborhoods in that.
That's exactly what happened to those neighborhoods. And so, well, what are you going to, like, if you're Italian, right? And you've got, you got the old neighborhood, and you could talk about, like, oh, hey, my sister's married to this guy, like, your cousins and aunts, uncles, people from the old country. You got all these connections, you got holidays, you got feast days, you got all this stuff to talk about. And you have a sense of yourself as an Italian. Well, when you have this sense of yourself, it's really difficult to push you around, particularly in a democratic society. And you're a lot easier to manipulate with things like pro sports and, beer and titties, if you're just a guy in the burbs with a bunch of other guys. And the way that they did that, the way that they busted people out, is this process that called blockbusting. And what they would do is frequently, like, Slayton people would make a shadow purchase for blacks, and like a Goldbergwitz would buy the house, and then, like, oh god, Goldbergwitz is moving in. I guess we can handle that, but thank God he's not a Mouignon, right? And then the moving van shows up and a bunch of eggplants get out the car, and you're like, oh god, they started showing up. And then what that does is, if it's like what happens when like the first man starts running away in a battle, right? Because for most of these people, and I think for most people still in America today, your chief form of wealth is your house.
Yeah.
And for a lot of these folks who'd come up from nothing, or living in, in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s, 1920s even, not much housing stock was built during the Depression. So you're living these terrible walk-up apartments, usually with like a terrible Orthodox Jewish landlord. Watching things change, I guess. You made it out. You've got your own house. This is going to be the building block of family wealth for the rest of the time, right? Well, if a bunch of blacks move in, it's worth nothing. And so one guy would come in and he'd bust the block, and then all of a sudden everybody else sells, and they take the money and run as fast as they can. And the last thing you want to be, it's like a game of musical chairs. The last thing you want to be is the last white guy to sell in the neighborhood, right? Then you like Clint Eastwood's character in
Gran Torino.
Yeah, Gran Torino.
Yeah,
you don't want to be that guy, because your house is worth nothing now, right?
It's this public-private partnership almost approach, where you have bad urban planning as a result of the 1954 ruling, Berman v. Parker, and Board of Education, and some other rulings from the government. You have like this, also like early anti-racism campaigns, early SJW bullshit. And on top of that, you have these shysters coming in and buying up the neighborhood, then just gifting it to blacks. And then you have the carrot out in the suburbs with low interest rates. And you have, one of the things that was so successful about these early suburbs is that they came with all the amenities. Like in the early days, like building a new neighborhood, building, a new small town somewhere was a lot of work. Like you had to figure out the denomination of the town. You had to set up a fire department. You had to set up your infrastructure. You had to actually build housing. You had to have your roads, all the amenities. If this is all built for you and you think it's already up to code, everything, all you have to do is just move in and buy it and abide by the homeowners association regulations.
Make sure your lawn's mowed and what it did.
The Gran Torino effect, though, is why you see these situations where these poor old white people are being, raped, lit on fire, and murdered in these towns in which they're the last holdouts because they were too slow on the draw for selling the house.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, that movie took place in Detroit, and we have to talk about Detroit. What happened to that place?
No, that movie took place in LA.
It's fair to mention that what was going on was essentially a process of ethnic cleansing. Like, people don't think about it in that terms because it's white people, but you had literally a population inflow that resulted in a ramp up of violence in order to purge an area of an ethnicity that was white people. There's this misconception that ethnic cleansing involves cattle cars and dudes with machine guns, but most of the time it's just oh, weird, a couple of blocks away, somebody just got brutally raped and murdered. A couple of blocks the other direction, somebody had their house broken into, and they're just robbed of everything that they own. Maybe we should think about getting the hell out.
I'm glad you make this point, Hank, because I wanted to say that it's interesting what the enemy does in this respect, because you've all heard the common refrain that, oh, well, America was treated the Irish and the Italians, oh, they're not white. You see, you've always been there's no such thing as white. When the same social engineers who committed ethnic cleansing against European ethnic minorities in America are the ones throwing that shit at you.
Yeah. In fact, the subtitle of E. Michael Jones's book is The Slaughter of Cities, Ethnic Cleansing as Urban Renewal as ethnic cleansing. And so that's what they did. And there's a couple other people in our thing here that you need to, if you really want to understand this stuff. Jones's book is a great start. Jones is a polymath. One of the great reasons I'm proud to be, I guess, on the alt-right is the quality of our people. We really do have the best people. And two other guys I want to mention are William S. Lind is actually a noted urbanist, and he's a transit expert. He's got a pretty good book, Moving Minds, Moving Markets. We can talk about that towards the end, about how absurd it is that the billions of dollars we send to Saudi Arabia because we all drive cars. And then Steve Saylor, the great Steve Saylor over at the Unz Review. Steve talks about this all the time. He has written like kind of how I got into this stuff is I've been a long-time reader of Steve's. But the
patron saint of noticing things.
Yes, the great Steve Saylor, the man who notices things. And one of the things that he noticed is that his I believe it's his mother-in-law and his father-in-law. His father-in-law was a musician with the Chicago Symphony. And, a staunch urban Democrat. We're not moving. And then, they got mugged twice in 6 months or something. Then they got the hell out.
Yeah. I mean, the same thing happened to my grandparents in part of the Midwest. And if you ask some of your relatives, like, this is actually really common. Like, if you used to have relatives that live in an urban area and you ask them why they've moved out circa anywhere between the 50s and the early 80s, like, you can get a lot of stories like this.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the things that you see, right, is that between the gas crisis and the crime wave in the 70s, it was just destroying America's cities. And people realized they had to do something about, like, making, keeping America's cities viable. And that's part of, the reason for the drug war. It's like, we got to get these guys in jail before they, these guys don't pay any taxes. We got to get them in jail before they drive more taxpayers out.
Well, let's talk about how we got to the gas crisis in the 70s from people living primarily in urban areas to suburban areas. How did people start moving out? The freeway, the interstate highway system, the car, automobile culture, all that.
Okay, so on an energy basis, like, trains are the most efficient way of moving over land. Like, water transportation is by far the most efficient way of getting things anywhere, people or goods. But when in 1950, we have all this industrial capacity that we're not doing anything with, for all the people who built the planes and tanks and stuff that won the war. We need something for them to do. They can build cars, right? I mean, we got the factories there. We got all these people employed. The housing boom was partly a jobs program. Like, we need more housing, obviously, because there were all these, not much housing got built in the Depression, but it was a jobs program. Like, okay, well, we can't slip back into Depression. How about if we offer these cheap loans? We're not actually depending, we're not expending a lot of money, but we can, and we have the house as collateral, so we're not risking a whole lot, but we're creating a social policy to create this housing boom.
There's a term in economics called a multiplier, and housing and actually I think the automotive sector are two of the most multiplicative of any industries, because essentially if you buy one of the products at the end, so house would be obviously all the timber and the shingling and the concrete and the labor that goes into building it and the land as well. To get that going, you have to have all these sort of feed-in industries. The same thing with automotive. If you buy a car, you have to have the energy industry, the oil industry. You have to have the road infrastructure built. You have to have the steel industry running. So it trickles out to the rest of the country and the society when you have these things stimulated on the demand side. And it does create a lot of activity. And if you want to grow the economy, have people employed, that's one way to do it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And from 1950 to 1975-ish, it worked great. I mean, the American dream, right? A house out in the burbs. You can grill on the weekends. You don't have to live in the city with all the dirt and the grime and the crime. And you can go for Sunday drives, and you get your own place, and you're not paying rent to no landlord and all this other stuff. Well, the gas crisis hit, right? And everyone's driving these
Buick Skylarks from my cousin Vinny.
72 Buick Skylark, right? And, it thing weighs as much as a tank. And all of a sudden, gas gets super relatively expensive. I mean, we look back on it like, oh, well, maybe I should get, a cheaper car or something. And, the crime, obviously, a big problem, the inflation, all of these issues, start to make it a little bit more difficult. It's still the norm, but it starts to be not the how shall I put this? It's not obviously perfect. Like in 1965 in an all-white suburb in, on Long Island, right? I mean, it's like, obviously this is the, Cold Springs Harbor, right? This is the best thing ever. Like this is paradise for a working guy. But starting around 1975, things start to not work as well. And one of the reasons, we'll get into this, I guess later, is that fundamentally the way the suburbs are designed and laid out, they don't work because for ease of math, let's just say that $1 million is the cost to the city of paving the road and putting in the sewer and all this other stuff for 100 houses. So this is $1,000 per house that each of these houses costs, and the city's only able to charge them, $100 a month or $100 a year in property taxes. And these numbers are completely made up and arbitrary, but for the purpose of illustration only, they'll work. So, in order to get that $10,000 back, or that $1,000 back, right? They've got to pay that $1,000 for 10 years, past plus the cost of upkeep. So it's probably more like 12 or 10 or 12 years before they've paid the city back for all that investment the city did. And the life of the road or the life of the infrastructure is only 10 years. So even though it takes 12 years to pay it back, it's only going to last 10. So you got to rebuild it. And you still owe money on building it the first time. And
this is a situation that, like, if you look at some random local cities, there's effectively two political lobbies that you need to be concerned about, and that's auto dealers and property developers. And the property developers are obviously the ones that have a lot more political impact in this situation. because they will do whatever is really necessary in order to get approval for their new subdivision to be built. The town will take out municipal loans or municipal bonds in order to fund this infrastructure development with the promise of the incremental tax revenue. But the thing is that the maturity on these bonds is so far in the future relative to the time horizon of the person who's actually making the decision that it's impossible for them to actually suffer any consequences of the sort of bad investment decision that they've made. So the property developer is making bank because they get their cash up front whenever they sell their houses. The bureaucrat or local city councilman or whatever is getting some nice padding on campaign contributions. Maybe they get a job, maybe their relatives get a job, and it only bites them in the ass 10, 15, because you can stretch it out 20 years down the line, at which point they're retired and no longer really care.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. So there's a quick point I wanted to make about Levittown that I forgot to make, but one of the more interesting things is that around the time of Levittown, you had, and I think Jones mentioned this, you had like the rise of the managerial economy, the managerial class. They were essentially filling up and populating a lot of these new suburbs, and they would then commute into the cities and exacerbated this commuting sprawl. There's two books. There's The Organization Man by William H. White, which is, I guess, some kind of cosmic irony. And then there's The Managerial Revolution by Burnham, I believe.
Yeah, James Burnham. That's right.
James Burnham. So both of these originated in either the early 20th century or towards the beginning of the second half. It played like a big role in the and I don't know, almost in like the formation of not just the people who were filling up these suburbs, like the employment, but into the fire economy, which we can get into later, and filling up like just the way that these things were handled, where you just had these sort of professional managerialists who were just thinking of more and more elaborate ways of managing the inner city blight and managing how white people used basic infrastructure to get from points A to B so they didn't have to live near the city blight. Like, this is really bizarre process, but I feel as if there's like some relation, and Jones makes a similar point.
Jones does.
Another book reacting to that I just throw out there would be Robert Nisbet's A Quest for Community, which was written in 1953.
Yeah, that's a good, and that's one of those myths, right? I mean, this is the whole point of the show, and one thing I greatly appreciate about it is that you guys point out all these, like, this is problems with this stuff are not new.
Yeah.
Right. Like Nisbet wrote that book, a half a century ago, and we're still dealing with it. And so one of the things that caused this problem that enabled it to continue, right, is that these tax-free municipal bonds. Puerto Rican bonds are essentially toilet paper right now. The state of Illinois' bonds are probably very close to toilet paper right now. And this kind of set of incentives that was set up to allow, the city to grow ever further outward, ever further, one exit down the highway. That's the phrase I use a lot. Is a deliberate creation of government policy. So without the federal government essentially allowing you to park your money in municipal bonds for free, none of this stuff would exist. None of these. Go ahead.
Just for some context, right now, if you buy California long-term municipal bonds, They're yielding about 3%, I think, on Vanguard, except for if you're buying municipal bonds, you're almost certainly in the top 10% of the income distribution because they're the only ones who are engaging in any savings in our screwed Great Recession economy. Probably more like top 5 to 1%, because presumably you live in California and incomes tend to be higher there.
So you're dealing with a bunch of opportunity costs now.
Well, you're paying a lot of California taxes on any income that you receive, and you're paying a lot of federal taxes on any income that you receive. So it's totally possible for an engineer at like some, Silicon Valley random big co to have like a 45% marginal tax rate, except for when you have interest coming in from municipal bonds, you're not paying income taxes on the state or the federal level to that. So that means that you take that yield, you divide it by 0.65 or by point. Well, my math isn't the best, but whatever. It's almost doubled the return that you get. So you have an amazing incentive to try to invest in these municipal bonds. The state is provided with a vastly increased funding source that lets them borrow for much cheaper because they would be paying that sort of tax adjusted yield on them if they did not have those tax advantages. When the states sell those bonds, they typically do them by having a large Wall Street bank underwrite them for a fee. So everybody is receiving sort of a massive benefit at every point in this process, except for the poor sucker who's going to be taxed 20 years down the line in order to actually pay for the redemption of that bond.
Right. A lot of these are, what is it? Forget the term, but basically you get the money back at the end of the period. So the city has to fork up all that principal plus the accrued interest.
Usually it's like a continuous issuance thing. So like every year, like come hell or high water, like the state of California issues more debt, they retire some other debt. But, they're issuing things in like, 10, 15, 20 year denominations, and most of them get snapped up by mutual funds or ETFs or what have you.
Right, but it's essentially paying off one credit card and putting something else on another credit card. Is the way I and
that's how our financial system operates.
Yeah, I mean this works, and to kind of get back to the system as a whole. You guys did a great episode with Ryan Landry on the petrodollar. Right. Well, what's the single greatest source of demand in the world for petroleum?
The automobile.
What market?
You mean what
Suburban
country?
Commuters.
Ding, 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 ding.
Right.
So one of the reasons, not just to get away from the blacks, but also, we need to create this huge demand. And up until 1975, it worked because, we had some oil here, gas was relatively cheap. But there's this, Burnham pointed it out forever ago, and Burnham used to be a communist, and then he ended up writing for National Review, and then being too hardcore for National Review, and was Sam Francis's mentor. James Burnham was / our guy, back in 1957 or whatever it was.
Yeah, there's a very difficult to find Burnham book called Machiavellian's Defenders of Freedom. You can get a PDF of it, but the actual book's very difficult. That's his, it's a pretty red pill book.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a must read.
What was the thesis of the book?
Machiavellian's Defenders of Freedom. I mean, he was coming at it from like a... hang on.
Yeah, I mean the interesting analysis that he has is sort of like how the ruling class develops their sort of internal view of their mandate to rule, and then how they sort of explain that. It's extremely influential in political science circles.
So to kind of tag on that ruling class thing,
You guys asked me about the interstate highway system, which was technically the National Defense interstate highway system.
Yeah, it was operated by the Secretary of Defense. He used to work for General Motors, something along those lines.
Wasn't it Secretary of War?
No, it was Secretary of Defense. It was after the reorganization.
During World War II, they called it that. I'm not sure when they changed the name.
It was Eisenhower who initiated the interstate highway program, correct?
Yes, it was. Yeah. And the Department of Defense had been reorganized from the War Department in the late 40s.
If you drive through Kansas, by the way, where he's from, you will see the first section of the highway completed and a big sign telling you that. It's very interesting. Part of history.
So we have this notion, right, of these deep state manager types who think that they can control everything. And what using, their marketing people, Madison Avenue, everyone is going to kind of Mad Men type world, right? We're going to all have these, everyone's going to drive a Ford Fairlane, and we're going to have these nice houses, and we're going to have all those commercial products. And you're going to buy grills, and you're going to buy this, and you're going to have cookouts, and it's going to be great, and you're going to drink beer with your buddies. But you really like whether or not they're your buddies is kind of irrelevant. Like, I don't know my neighbors all that well. Do you guys?
I hate my neighbors.
Same.
My neighbors are awesome, but we never hang out.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, one of the things they also got people hooked on, this is another Jones point from somewhat unrelated topic, but is the history of credit cards and how credit cards are introduced really in the 60s and 70s because there was an abundance of cheap credit, but wages were stagnant. Salaries were somewhat stagnant too for the majority of these like managerialist, growing fire economy people, along with manufacturing workers. Nothing was really growing well. So so there was this idea like, okay, you go get your mortgage, you go get your credit card, and credit's cheap and it's no big deal. And you get your grill, your car, you commute either to your factory or to the city, whatever. And this is just the American way of life. It is Madison Avenue, essentially telling people just go be a middleman somewhere, get your credit cards, and commute for an hour every day.
Well, one thing that's really fascinating me about this bringing up here, Dark Enlightenment, is this relationship between the empire and the suburbs. Because you have it tying it to the, geopolitics of oil, as well as the great changes and movements in the population following the second half of the European Holocaust, when all these people were coming back, and then you had all these shufflings around and moving people out to the cities. All these dynamics, there seems to always be the imperial elephant in the room as conditioning some of these patterns.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is Jones is big on the psychological warfare thing, but it's part of it, right? That to give you an example of the empire in the room. I'm guessing you guys were like 10 when 9/11 happened. But I was
not to give too much away, but I was a lot younger.
Yeah, Hans wasn't born.
No, I was.
I'm just kidding.
But I'm an old man, and I was in my early 20s.
That doesn't make you old.
In this thing, it does. Landry and I are going to be sitting in the retirement home going, back when I was, back in my day, edgelords were only on pull, but shitload of retirement home. Anyway, where...
We'll make sure to get you a nice white nurse.
I don't think those exist anymore.
They cost a lot more.
So one of the things that the empire does, right, is okay, if George Bush had been serious after
after, and this is how you know it's a lot of horseshit, right? Is that if he'd been serious on September 12th, 2001, he'd be like, all right, that's it. America is no longer in love with the car. We're going to, like, people are going to take the train. People are going to walk. We're going to live like people in Europe. We're going to make some serious freaking changes to our society so that we're not funding these people to the tunes of billions of dollars a week. You know?
Well, it's interesting the way that, like, there's two sides of this, because there's been kind of really heavy government incentives and subsidization for things like sort of, you know, roads, you know, effective subsidies in foreign policy terms, certainly, for the price of oil and gasoline, these sort of structural arrangements that promote suburbanization. But you're starting to see kind of the wheel turn in that, like, you know, now it seems like all incentives are pointed towards making sure that people are deprived of the sort of freedom that having your own car represents. Like, all of the same crowd of, you know, well-educated Harvard class, etc., are promoting mass urbanization, like the consolidation of population into easier to control units, self-driving cars, which of course will fundamentally not be allowed to be under your actual control in terms of where you want to go and when. Do you think that sort of there has been actually a shift, or are these just sort of like two competing sides of the same dialectic?
I don't know. That's a great question.
Can try and tackle that. I mean, like,
I would say that the drive towards smart growth and increased urbanization and that kind of thing is a reaction to a failure of the previous model. And to just kind of finish up with the previous model discussion. 70s, 80s, you get the good schools thing, you know, people are always talking about. And in the 40s and 50s and maybe even into the 60s, you could still be relatively close. And the suburbs serve as this great barrier to entry for bad neighbors. That's effectively what they are, is this, you know, like, you might not be able to afford a car for cash like a rich person, but you can afford a payment on a car and a mortgage, and you've got yourself together enough that you can actually afford to get out of the city, and your house is, you know, your house is your vehicle for
better, because, like, you're being screened for credit. Like, you need not only to have, like, the cash in hand, like, that could have come from anywhere. Like, you can be a real scumbag. But if you're taking out a car loan and a house loan, there's an entire infrastructure designed to make sure that you're able to essentially keep your promises.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, to tie this into the oil crisis of the 70s and into credit, like, and one of the reasons why the credit crunch and the oil crisis at the time were so damaging to the United States was more, I think, of a psychological effect it had on people. Where the last, you could say, 30 years up to that point of post World War II messaging was essentially like, credit is cheap and you should go get credit, and oil is cheap and you should drive wherever you want. And, like, that was the fundamental American ethos, was like, I'm going to have really cheap credit on my house and I'm going to go on road trips for really cheap with the family, or I'm able to live way outside the city and to commute really easily without having to get on the train. Like, that, the psychological effect of having that sort of almost robbed, I think, was pretty damaging to the economy, more almost not maybe more so than the actual economic crisis, but certainly had a huge deleterious effect on how people behaved. And then when you had Reagan come in, it was essentially like, okay, we're putting all that behind. You know, I'll make a deal with these Arabs to like get oil cheaper and to make credit cheaper and to get the fire economy started. And you know, one of the latter things that Jimmy Carter did, which is indisputably now one of the early causes of our housing crisis in 2007, 2009, was the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977, which is where he was like getting or using federal law to force commercial savings and loans banks to put money into low-income neighborhoods and to make financial products and mortgages that were just not suited for these neighborhoods easily available.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, and this all ties together, of course.
And when you're talking about like George Bush, like right after 9/11, how much did the Iraq and Afghan war end up costing us? Like $3 or $4 trillion.
Oh, easily and indirectly as well. I mean, if you look at the price of oil, I mean, everybody criticizes Putin, but don't forget, like, he became very powerful because Russia enjoyed an oil boom, in part because this country caused a shortage of oil in the Middle East. And everybody's like, oh, it's all for oil. Well, we didn't get any of it. And maybe the Texas firms who were pumping it made some money, but we didn't actually acquire any physical oil. And it was just a whole total shock. It was almost comparable to the 70s and how profound that price of oil shock went up.
$5
That's a huge cost to every economy.
So to Hank's point, one of Hank's points earlier, like imagine if you took that money that you think the opportunity cost here is unimaginable. Like imagine you took that money over time and then you invested it into American infrastructure. So you got people off of cars. I think you were saying this too, Dark. You got people off of cars. You completely overhauled the transportation infrastructure. You completely overhaul your fuel efficiency, your subsidies, direct grants, whatever it takes to get this done. You craft some kind of pseudo foreign policy for the Middle East, like we're only going to help these regimes to ensure like decent oil flow, but we're going to do everything we can to like get off of this fuel source from these people. And if we have to use American fuel, fine. But instead it became like, well, we're going to go over there, we're going to knock these countries over, and then we're going to take the oil. And then so little of that actually happened. I think like recently, or maybe like a year ago, I saw news that China has doubled or tripled its oil investments in Iraq. Like that's just cheap fuel for the Chinese market. That's not necessarily going back to the United States after trillions of dollars wasted in an attempt to gain cheap oil.
So
and blood.
Yeah. Well, and so right, Reagan, financializes the economy.
Yeah.
And everyone starts moving one. You got to have them good schools, right? So people keep moving one exit further down the highway. Then the Cold War ends, and you get the peace and prosperity of the 90s. The unwritten story on that is, again, Steve Saylor, lots and lots of it, is the Hispanic influx starting after the 86 amnesty, right? Because not only do you have the native underclass, you've got this foreign underclass coming in, and they're putting even more pressure on schools.
Right. So you have these people like crafting, or go ahead.
And so you have this further acceleration out into, not just the suburbs, the exurbs, an hour and a half every day each way.
Yeah.
Which is not uncommon in California.
Oh, it's extremely
somebody.
It's miserable to watch these people go back and forth on the highway at commuter hours. I mean, I fortunately don't have to do it, but I don't know if I would want to live in a city where I had to. I don't know if it's worth it. I mean, it's like 2-3 hours of your day sitting behind a wheel and God knows what weather, and just, the movie Falling Down portrays sort of the frustration of somebody having to go through this and just leaving their car on the highway, and they're just like, fuck this. It's horrible.
So let's break that down a little bit further, guys. The reason we're here driving.
Yeah.
Podcasts are a thing because upwardly mobile white people felt like if they listened to one more, hello, it's W something 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 FM, and welcome to Get the Lead Out on Thursdays, where we play lots and lots of Led Zeppelin every Thursday for all of eternity because we're stuck in 1972 and there's no greater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with Steppenwolf.
Right. And if you, I mean,
if I hear Magic Carpet Ride one more fucking time, man.
Exactly. You know, if I hear one more Tumbling Dice, I'm going to get out of this car and and it's not to say that I don't like the Stones or I don't like Led Zeppelin, but you've got this, you know, like commercial radio, which is terrible, to be honest, fam. And you have all these intelligent people that are like, God, I cannot, you know.
Well, since we're talking about social engineering, I mean, this is a rabbit hole I could reserve for another episode, but I could talk a lot about this. The late Dave McGowan had a lot of great work on the dimension of social engineering behind that music of the 60s and its continued playing on the radio to keep people in sort of a mental box. There's a lot there.
There is a lot there. And I'll just say this and then move on. What you had is the media companies all have their 6-pack of radio stations and they all play the same stuff. There's the Menopausal Women station, Magic something something .9, and then there's the, you know, we're a real man and you love real stuff because you like sports, not like those other idiots over there. You know about football because you're a man. And then there's, you know, the I'm stuck when I graduated high school, you know, for various different flavors of guys. And books on tape became a thing because smart people were like, God, I can't listen to, you know, like I gotta, like, if I'm going to spend 90 minutes a day in a car, at least I'm going to be doing something. Then it gives you the illusion of you're doing something, right? Podcast, like, oh, well, if I'm going to commute 90 minutes every day, well, maybe I can listen to the show and maybe I'll listen to these 20th century guys and you know, at least then I'm learning something while I'm in the car. I'm not just staring at red lights for 90 minutes each way as I come into this, you know, because I have to live 90 minutes away from Los Angeles for my kids to go to a school where they're not going to get beat up.
So in order
to draw this connection, this is fascinating to me. It makes a lot of sense. I can relate to it.
To take a cue from Steve Saylor in the art of just noticing things, I want to just lay this out for the listeners so you can determine if this sounds normal or rational to you. You have rich white families, or I would say affluent. Rich is, I think, an improperly used word now, but affluent, moving into the exurbs, which are essentially like the hinterland at some point. Or they're moving into the mountains, or they're moving onto the edge of a desert, moving onto the edge of forests. And more and more, you have these people crafting increasing levels of homeowner association regulations in order to maintain some kind of normalcy that I think people long for in those old ethnic neighborhoods or just traditional neighborhoods that form organically. You have an underclass being imported sometimes through public transportation, through 4 or 5 buses and maybe a train, just to arrive, or after an hour and a half of commuting, just to arrive from their ghetto or their slums where they live to these hinterlands, to then deliver to these people, you know, services that they don't want to pay their teenagers in the neighborhood to do. Like, does this sound normal to anyone, or does this start to sound like similar conditions that have preceded the fall of a lot of civilizations, where the people live?
You're right on.
People live further and further away from the centers of economic activity. They import foreigners, and they expend increasing amounts of resources in finance, in petroleum, in metal, in order to just get people from A to B. And then every couple of years, the taxes are increased through some local proposition or statewide proposition in order to fund the welfare for this increasing underclass.
Yeah. there's a man, Edward Tainter, who, if you haven't read The Collapse of Complex Societies, it is a brisk and very, very good book. But it does describe exactly this dynamic, how you have, in the context of sort of a expanding empire, you have very high returns initially that let you sort of fill out and expand to occupy whatever the kind of limits of your environment are very rapidly. And then once that's accomplished and your frontier is sort of closed, what you end up doing is expending increased amounts of resources on increased structural complexity that lets you extract ever more marginal gains from the territory that you already have. And this is fine. Like, you know, you can be borrowing at 4% to get a 4.1% control return ad infinitum, except for this makes you incredibly vulnerable to a structural shock. So you have to ask, like, okay, we have all of this sort of decaying infrastructure, and maybe we can make it last for, you know, another couple years, whatever. But say there's an earthquake in California, or say that New Orleans gets flooded, or that there's a gigantic fire in New York City, or something like this. Like, you rapidly run into a situation where your returns have gone from very marginally positive, maybe negative, but long-term, to like incredibly negative and incredibly fast. And now you're just depopulating vast swaths of your area, or you're taxing entire sectors of your population into oblivion to pay off the barbarians, or eventually you just run out of time and rope and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down.
So
well, that's where we're at now. And kind of Jane Jacobs started this in 1961 with The Death and Life of Great American Cities, when she kind of gave Robert Moses the business, who's, you know, there's two Jews complaining about what to do with the Lower East Side. And Moses was the kind of the guy behind the interstate highway system. He built a bunch of the highways in New York. And this new urbanist, listeners might be familiar with James Howard Kunstler. He's right about what he's right about. I can't stand him personally because he's just this obnoxious heeb who hates the people that make his life possible. But his books, The Geography of Nowhere and Home from Nowhere, kind of get into this stuff. Too Much Magic, that kind of thing. What we're at now is that extracting kind of death spiral place where you know, the credit is no longer cheap, or maybe your kids are able to make it work, but your grandkids aren't, because the wear on a car, like Uber is a perfect example of like a structure put up to kind of make the burbs work, but it doesn't, because Uber doesn't pay you to drive. It pays you to destroy your car and pretend you're working.
Uber to me is just such a perfect example of what innovation has been reduced to today.
Exactly.
They haven't really created anything. They basically just built a very simple app, which I can tell you is pretty simple to make, from doing a little of that type of work. And they're good at marketing, okay? So I'll give them a lot of credit for that. That's their key strength. But all they did was they don't even own any assets. All they did was they got a bunch of people to download an app, and then they're using other people's cars, and they take a transaction fee. They didn't really make anything. It's just sort of like taking this decaying system that doesn't really work and basically just collecting a toll on top of it. And
well, what they did was they assumed the regulatory, or the potential cost of a regulatory backlash. Because what they did, you're exactly right, is that they bypassed a decaying system by essentially operating more or less illegally, depending on your exact area. Airbnb did the same thing. Like, you're not really allowed to engage in housing discrimination, but if it's just you renting out your room, or your vacation house or whatever on Airbnb, then, I mean, nobody's going to really come after you for deciding that you want a certain type of person and not a certain other kind. Similarly with Uber, like, you know, you can hail a taxi and demand that they drive you to the ghetto, and like they have to do it theoretically. But your Uber driver can just decline to take that ride up front.
Right. And that's and Uber doesn't pay you enough to actually, like, it pays you enough for gas. It doesn't pay you enough to get a new transmission when your transmission blows out because you've been driving 90,000 miles a year. And as these suburbs have grown and grown and grown, the costs associated with them have kept increasing, right? So for every mile of road, you need, you know, sewer and high-speed internet and electricity and all of these other things. Those costs increase as you get further out. And an older model of development is kind of town and country, right? If you think of a farmhouse on, say, 150 acres, values being generated on all 150 of those acres, and it's being concentrated at the farmhouse. No one cares about electrifying the back 40. It doesn't need it. It doesn't matter. So you can actually kind of extract cows and barley and stuff and get resources from that whole piece of property and concentrate it at the house. Yeah. Or the small village.
The right? Farm is like the ultimate American symbol of rugged independence, because you really don't need anything other than good weather to grow your crops. And if you have a drought, you have a problem. But this is why red states are in farm areas, because they're very independent. They don't need this big government garbage. They just don't depend on it. And they distrust it instinctually, and they're right to, because they look at the cities and they're all sort of stuck in these commuter cars, or they're living in a housing project. They're not really free. It's horrible.
This one of the smartest things the U.S. government, U.S. federal government, ever did in the 19th century, and even to an extent the very early 20th century, were a series of homesteading acts, which were these sort of implicitly hands-off pieces of legislation that said, you go out there, you populate these regions for us, you do whatever you want as long as you abide by some very basic rules, and we'll have the military protect you from Indian tribes, or potentially, Mexico to the south. And this was essentially what created the massive amount of farm capital, or agricultural capital, that we have in this country, that's allowed it to even have this massive population growth and to handle this huge amount of resource expenditures.
Right. But the city, right? The city makes things work by stacking people on top of each other enough that that you have 1,000 people in, a mile, or I think that about 1,000 people a mile is per square mile is the kind of the bare minimum for making a city work. So you have 3,000 people, and you split these enormous costs of city living with the sidewalk and the fire and electric and everything else amongst all these people, and it's actually bearable. The suburbs, when they're not like super close on rail and all this other stuff, when you have these expenditures of roads and cars and all of that, have the worst of both worlds, because you have not a sufficient density to actually make everything work like in a city, but you're also sufficiently spread out that the farmhouse, like, you've got to heat all 6 sides of your cube in a suburb house. Whereas like in a row house, you've got 2 walls that you share, so you're lowering your costs, right? Well, these little mini English manor houses that all the suburban houses are, people tend to forget that these English manor houses, one, have a manor attached to them, and you have hundreds of acres of stuff around, gardens, tenant farmers, that kind of thing, to support this great grand house. When you're on like, a half an acre, you're not, you don't have any peasants working in, the quarter acre that you've got in the backyard to farm and kick the rent up to the house. You just have this sunk cost thing going on. And, the people went from the farm to the city with the Industrial Revolution and needing less labor on farms and needing less labor and more labor in the cities. And in the 80s, 90s, and especially in the 2000s, we don't even need the industrial labor anymore. So what do people do? If you're working a factory job, making $25 an hour doing skilled labor, and back when $25 an hour meant something, you could afford something. But now we don't even have that. And we're expecting people to bear all these costs associated with living in the burbs while working as baristas at Starbucks.
Yeah.
And
that's go ahead and finish.
Go ahead, Hans.
Well, I was just going to say, gone back and found there's a great graph from Global Macro Monitor at macromon.wordpress.com. They have a really good breakdown of the fall of America's manufacturing economy and the rise of America's fire economy. And it's about like between 1985 and 1989. That is when these two influxes meet. And by 2009, the fire economy was 21.5% and manufacturing was 11.2%. Whereas if you look at 1947, it was 25.6% manufacturing and 10.5% fire. Fire meaning finance, insurance, real estate, and rental and leasing economy.
Right. And that's one of the great things of the 20th century. And so why have people talked about gentrifying? Why are tiny houses and things? I urge listeners to check out Ryan Landry's podcast on tiny houses. And it's just people realizing the system doesn't work for them and hipsters not wanting to live in a trailer. I mean, I can't remember who.
Yeah.
Was it Hans that said that? One of the guys said earlier.
That was me. Yeah.
Nick. So that was great. That's a great line. It's just hipsters just don't want to admit that they live in a trailer, so they call it a tiny house. But that's your way of getting around the system. There's this huge regulatory environment.
Yeah.
Where every house has to have X number of, 50 feet of frontage on the road, and the streets have to be 40 feet wide for fire trucks, and there has to be this much electricity and this much water and this much this and this much that. Well, if you're 22 years old and you have $150,000 in student loan debt and you can't actually get a real job and you're working as a barista in Starbucks, you can't afford any of that.
Yeah.
And right now what you're seeing is these younger people, giving up on the dream of, because, there is something to the suburbs being this ennui inducing, soulless, terrible place. I mean, Jim Kunstler, who I've said I'm not a fan of because he is such a freaking heeb, is right about how terrible the suburbs are in terms of aesthetics, in terms of function. And I urge listeners who are interested in this stuff to check his stuff out for those reasons. But when you grow up in that environment and then you're like, well, I don't really want to live like in this lame, soulless environment that is, my parents or my grandparents, boomer grandparents are like, well, we're going to get rich because you're going to buy this house for $500,000. Like, no, I'm not. I can't afford it. Like, I'm in my mid-30s and I can, I barely afford
first
a
of
house.
all, let's sort of evaluate that sort of assumption right there. Okay, you're going to get rich by buying something. Well, how does that creating value, first of all? That is basically just gambling and speculating.
Well, that's what's so absurd about classifying a home as a investment good. I mean, it's a consumption good.
Sure.
Yeah, but there was this Wall Street attempt for a while, and even like Greenspan was very guilty of this. Was the tap your home equity strategy, which is that there's hidden value.
Financial engineers, I swear to God,
that there's hidden
They're not
value
worth,
in your home.
100 of them are not worth a mechanical engineer.
You just have to mine it out of there and make sure you come down to the local branch of one of the 5 or 6 major banks, and we'll help you do it. And we'll take a small fee off the top.
Get that reverse mortgage, and then you could go retire to Florida, and then yeah.
Exactly. You can just tap your home equity, like especially for the boomers who might have 2 or 3 houses across the country. Tap your home equity on those houses so you can send your kid off to university so that they don't have to pay a massive amount of debt. But those children can barely, if ever, afford to then inherit those homes on their own because wages are down and salaries are not growing at the rate that they need to be. And you've effectively killed off middle-class inheritance of property.
Yeah, I mean, if I was going to try to like summarize a grand theme of this whole show, it's that the U.S. built up an incredible amount of social and physical capital up until probably the mid 1950s. And the process of the last half of the century was just a series of strip mining endeavors where they realized that, holy shit, we have all of this money locked up in this valuable real estate. We need to capture some of that by block busting and destroying these communities, taking a commission along the way. We need to cash out the home equity and put people into rental units so that we can extract the value of those houses. We need to take these social arrangements that have existed and we need to break them up and attempt to liquidate that into lower wages so that we can have a more flexible, quote unquote, labor markets, more competitive. In example after example, the thing is not the creation of some additional capital source. It's actually the liquidation of that. So now, sure, you have, some amount of cash in hand or profits go up or whatever, but it's not in any way, shape, or form sustainable.
Yeah. So basically, this was an attempt to take all of the work accomplished by the Industrial Revolutions, the agricultural revolutions, and the financial revolutions of the United States from the latter end of the 18th century all the way out through the 19th century, and probably the first 2 decades of the 20th century, pouring them into resource expenditures in order to create suburbs. All of that work went towards the creation of artificial communities that at this point most people cannot afford to live in and are rapidly in decline.
And the people who made this possible, the productive people who made this possible, have been deprived of any kind of ownership stake in their society and effectively been turned into serfs.
Yeah,
that's correct. So in most suburbs, right? And I'll stick a link in the chat or something. There was a great Storify on Twitter that I think made the rounds about John Legal and Juan Illegal.
Oh yeah.
And just real briefly, between the taxes and the fees that John makes at $25 an hour, okay, before inflation and all this other stuff, $25 an hour is a lot of money. Now it's hardly anything, especially if you got kids. And
yeah, but just to show you how desperate people are, I know a lot of people who think that's a lot of money.
Oh,
really?
Yeah, there are a lot of people for whom that is a lot of money.
But it's not compared to what their parents are making if you adjust for inflation and the cost of living. I mean, so you're right.
Yeah,
I'm just
absolutely.
saying, people are just fucking desperate. And these unemployment numbers...
These suburbs, right?
They just don't make sense.
These suburbs are, the cost increases with every mile from your job that you go. And the only way, and which is why you see people either trying to gentrify, right? And young people today don't have kids. in anywhere near the numbers that they need to make society continue to function. So, of course, that's an excuse to import more people from failing third world countries that can't make things work.
I've talked to a lot of people from Europe who are under the spell of the mainstream media. It's just as powerful over there as it is here. And they'll tell me the reason they need more immigrants is because they're not having enough children and they need to grow the economy or something. And I'm like, dude, like, do you get paid by the banks because you're basically doing free marketing for them? You don't benefit from this. Your financial crisis and your banks, should tell you, who's running things and who's profiting, and you're not profiting from this. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but it's all over the Western world, this crap.
It is. And
that kind of statement is that of a serf whose soul has been totally crushed by the system. So,
well, so this system of suburbs is heavily dependent on government set asides of things like municipal bonds, like federal highway money, like state matching grants from various different ways of moving money around, where of course Goldman Sachs is going to get their cut. But that's failing, because as we alluded to during the call, and we were talking about it beforehand, the state of Illinois is completely broke. This Riverside, the very first rail suburb, model railroad suburb in the country, the place where this stuff all started is failing. And what people are doing to kind of get out of this system is things like tiny houses. And, as long as you're physically safe and you don't care about the quality of the school because you homeschool, that's cheap, right? In Memphis, there's like the richest county and the poorest county in Tennessee are like right next to each other. And the richest county in Tennessee is of course right next door and is super white. And I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me. I think it's Shelby County. And then there's the actual county in Memphis. Memphis is in Shelby County. So like Shelby County, Tennessee is where Memphis is at. And Memphis, and then there's towns like Bartlett or Collieryville outside of it that are super wealthy. Well, you're paying, that $1 million house in Bartlett, at least $200,000 of that house is, I'm not next to these people in Memphis. And so a lot of that wealth in the suburbs of, this neighborhood, these houses are worth $500,000. No, they're not. They're just, it's this artificial price inflation because people are willing to pay $150,000 to get away from criminals.
Yeah. Like I have, actually have, as we're kind of wrapping this up, a report from the American Society of Civil Engineers, their 2017 infrastructure report card, which is a pretty depressing read. They break down each piece of American infrastructure under its own report, but I just want to read the quick overview of the roads report. Actually, Adam, if you have something on this before I...
No, finish up. I'll say after you're done.
So here's the overview. And this ties into the fact that Illinois is essentially in financial meltdown right now. And the Department of Transportation, the Federal Department of Transportation, is refusing to help with infrastructure payouts and with labor on infrastructure projects in the state of Illinois going forward because of their financial situation. America's roads are often crowded, frequently in poor condition, chronically underfunded, and are becoming more dangerous. More than 2 out of every 5 miles of America's urban interstates are congested, and traffic delays the cost the country $160 billion in wasted time and fuel in 2014. 1 out of every 5 miles of highway pavements is in poor condition, and our roads have a significant and increasing backlog of rehabilitation needs. After years of decline, traffic fatalities increased by 7% from 2014 to 2015, with 35,092 people dying on America's roads.
Those are great numbers.
This complete you're talking about like the artificial rising of housing costs for the suburbs, but in the same vein, there's this complete destruction of the American infrastructure that was the envy of the world in the 50s and the 60s as it was being built. Like the American interstate highway system was a huge milestone, not just because of its size and scale, and like at the time
cost $500 billion to make.
Yeah,
it's pretty astounding.
How well made it was and materials used, but the fact that this was a huge political obstacle in the United States to get states to work with one another and the federal government in order to craft these cross-state highways, which in the history of the United States was this massively contentious topic. And this huge overcoming that the United States had has just been totally wiped out to the point where now America's roads get a D grade, which is worse than the overall grade America's infrastructure gets, which is at D+.
I have a couple of examples on the infrastructure. So in 2007, I believe the bridge in Minnesota just collapsed, like it just fell into the water. And then in terms of why this is happening, why are they not being maintained? Is there not enough money? And if there isn't enough money, why not? And why is there such a higher cost today to do this stuff? I'll give you a proof of that. Inflation adjusted, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco cost $600 million. It probably took maybe 3 years to finish. By comparison, in the same inflation adjusted dollars, the eastern span of the Bay Bridge in the same city cost $6 billion, 10 times as much. And I think it took about 10 years to finish. I think a little bit more than that. And if you add in the planning phases and everything, of course, it's longer. So why is this happening? Like, what's going on in society to make these things not work anymore?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. I wouldn't be doing this. I'd be making a ridiculous amount of money solving that particular question. No, everything is falling apart. I think you guys are probably familiar with John Derbyshire.
Yeah.
He made the point years ago. Like, we can't even hang people who like commit double murder and rape puppies. Like in a reasonable amount of time. Like, I could go kill a nun and do terrible things to her corpse and turn myself in and say, please execute me, and it would still take a decade. That was
my first red pill as a child. That I've been fixated on that exact question all my entire life. It has never ever made sense to me, and it was the sign that I was living in clown society.
Yeah,
because the same people will go and they'll slaughter 1 million Iraqis.
Yes, they will. The same people that will not let you just execute all these violent hood rats that murder people left and right will be like, oh, good. Madeleine Albright, 1 million dead Iraqis is worth it. So
exactly.
to kind of give you real quickly the grades by category for this is an infrastructure report card.org from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Our aviation gets a D, our bridges get a C+, our dams get a D, our drinking water gets a D, our energy gets a D+, our hazardous waste gets a D+, inland waterways get a D, levees get a D, transit gets a D-, wastewater gets a D+, solid waste a C+, schools D+, roads D, rail B, public parks D+, and ports a C+.
Now, it's important to mention in all of this that, like, when you're talking about the American Society of Civil Engineers, you're talking about literally people employed by these projects. So This is not a neutral assessment. They're not ever going to be like, all right, guys, it's all good. Let's go home.
Yeah, no, this is, I mean, there is a fair bit of rent breaking.
But this is a bipartisan issue, but never anything ever seems to get done. I mean, both Obama and Trump actually cited the same statistic. I mean, the report that you mentioned, Obama quoted, and Trump made a big part of his platform about building. Yeah, but nothing ever happens. So what's going on?
Well, and the reason nothing ever happens, the reason we can't fix anything, right, is that our fundamental model of being able to make places economically viable does not work. You know,
we all agree with that.
The sprawl
why and what do we do
about
it?
Houston, the sprawl of the city of Houston is the size of the state of Massachusetts.
Houston is ungodly. If anybody has never been there, don't. If you can avoid it.
The size of the sprawl of the city of Houston covers, I think, the same amount of area as the state of Massachusetts. The sprawl in Atlanta stretches basically from Atlanta, or almost from Alabama all the way into South Carolina.
You know, this,
I mean, we have people literally commuting across state lines into.
This brings me to my question as to the social engineers responsible for this. They live in the cities, so they're making these places hellscapes, and there has to be there's a natural law blowback to this. I mean, what's going to become of these? They can't get around except by helicopter in the cities.
Oh, that's already happened in India, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
I've been there and I've seen it happen, and I was like, "What's that?" And it's like, "Oh, that's Mukesh Ambani. He's going to work. He's flying in a helicopter." So, I mean, is that what our future is going to look like?
Yes.
Well, we have two choices here. We can, to quote my buddy Danny, we can crush the urbanite, or we can live in beautiful Sao Paulo, right, with our favelas and then our super rich people taking helicopters to work. And our current model doesn't work, which I think is obvious to everyone. It's just that only those of us on the outer thought crime right are willing to say the reason it doesn't work. And most of the people, whether it's Andres Duany in Suburban Nation or other, most people involved with the Congress for New Urbanism, Chuck Marone at strongtowns.org, they've got some great ideas about how to, backfill cities, turn suburban, make suburban city centers viable places to live again. They have all these great ideas, but they don't want to actually deal with the fundamental underlying premise, I think, which is the composition of the nation. And you can't have people who aren't incapable of living in an urban environment in a civilized way in urban environments without making them uncivilized places to be. And I think the thing that we need to do as dissident rightists is to re-collectivize things. A show I did that didn't get published, hopefully it will be published at identitydixie.com with my friends Johnny Monoxide of the Paranormies on TRS Radio and Vicente Surface is making colonies. Okay, and remember, if you're a listener to this show, I mean, you're probably a 2 standard deviations in intelligence white man. I'm guessing is the demographic profile of the listener to this show. Society needs you a whole lot more than you need it. If you're not married with kids, you don't need hardly anything from society. So stop expecting things from society and do what's in your own best interest. Get 10 guys together that are shitlords go to your local TRS pool party or your Stormer book club or whatever. And I mean, none of the Muslims, obviously, but get a house with these guys and split costs. Go to Costco. If you're married with kids, find a way to recollectivize the things like schools, like
we need to have our own communities.
Yes, we need our own communities. Build those communities.
I mean, I see it.
And on like local political basis, like you'd be surprised if you live in a small town. Like it may very well be that literally the first guy to raise his hand and say, "I'm willing to be on the local water board or the local zoning commission," is quite able to get the job if you're at all like, somewhat of a personable person. So, once you start looking into like, okay, like maybe I'm starting to get a little bit older, looking a little bit more respectable. I've got a wife, I've got kids, and I want to improve my local community. Like, it's not that hard to test the waters.
No. And just as as something I thought of doing as a possibility for me in a few years, find a chunk of property for cheap out in the middle of nowhere. Put a building on it that has laundry facilities and like a big common room and like a big kitchen. And then you get like 10 shitlords, each with their own tiny house where they can like use the bathroom and that kind of stuff. And sleep and all that. And rent it out to them. I mean, I'm by far from the smartest guy in this thing. I'm nowhere near as smart as say Landry or some of the other guys running around here. Find other ways to get out of the system. The reason we have such terrible infrastructure reports isn't just that the guys doing the grades make a whole bunch of money if being paid to fix it. That's certainly part of the problem, but also because fundamentally, the way we do things can't work. You can't have transfer payments to city and local governments and state governments when the state and local governments are run by a bunch of third world sub IQ, super high time preference, don't know anything.
If anybody doubts this thesis, look at Detroit and who's been running it over the past 40 years.
Or Atlanta. Or
I've thrown around with the guys. I mean, I've talked about, I see as a genuine possibility in America's future an almost Maoist style revolution of the people on the outsides of the cities, taking them back. I see that as genuinely possible, albeit not for a lot of other things would come first. But the simple fact is the system is trying to kill us. And if we can survive, if we can outlive it, we can get the last laugh and we can put the knife right in its throat.
Yeah, that will. Whether that's, and it's the financial system, it's the fire economy, it's the lack of manufacturing jobs, it's the importation of hostile peoples to take the service jobs, and you're supposed to just be a good boy and go to college and find a job managing these people, doing something useless, who knows what, and you're supposed to take that house out in the burbs and put up with the 2-hour commute times coming in from the Inland Empire all the way into Los Angeles and all that other stuff. Is never going to work. The American dream is a lie.
You have only your chains to lose, white man.
That's right. And so if you learn anything from this show, realize that the history of the 20th century, the arc of history bends towards screwing the white man, to paraphrase Barack Obama. And whether it's forcing you out of your ethnic neighborhoods via weaponized blacks, or forcing you one exit down the highway with those people's kids, or beating up your friend that's gentrifying a place because he can't afford anywhere else except, you know, the worst part of Harlem because he's a barista with $100,000 of student loan debt from his photography degree. You are expected to just be a good little tax farm and to live the way society and the government have set it up. And a lot of this stuff has been set up ahead of time for you, and you have absolutely no say in it. Your only choice is to secede however you can, and whether it's tiny houses or having roommates or whatever, I don't know. But you got to do something. Because the myth of the 20th century that you can live in a nice house with a nice girl and have 2.5 kids in a car was just that. And it's a myth. There is no such thing as a nice suburb. And increasingly, there's no such thing as a nice girl either. So that's a separate issue and a whole separate podcast, and you don't want me talking about that. I'm not the expert on that. But don't buy the myth of the suburbs, fellas.
5 years ago, this was a vast checkerboard of potato farms on New York's Long Island. Today, a community of 60,000 persons living in 15,000 homes, all built by one firm. This is Levittown, one of the most remarkable housing developments ever conceived. The idea that came to a man named Bill Levitt was this: why not apply to the building of houses the same principles that have brought other American industries to their unexcelled peaks of efficiency and service? Why not mass produce the elements that go to make up a house, just as the auto industry does with the parts that go into a new car? Bill Levitt had some other ideas. Put kitchen and bathroom back to back and let them share the same plumbing. Let your plumbers do their work without interruption and without waiting for the carpenter or the bricklayer to get out of the way. Pre-cut your lumber so it's all ready to be assembled into the frame of a house. With the waste removed, one truck can deliver to the building site all the rough lumber that will go into 2 complete Levitt homes. It's really a matter of organization and planning, getting rid of waste motion. When the foundation is ready, coils for the radiant heating are there. Not a day too soon or a day too late. Without delay, the steam fitters finish their work and move on to the next house, and right behind them come the masons to lay the underflooring. Power-driven trowels make the job a lot easier and faster. Levittown houses are not prefabricated. Prefabrication means a factory operation in which large quantities of materials are kept moving to the workers. Here the opposite is true. The construction crews are moved to a waiting line of materials. This sort of organization and efficiency is all important in the vast defense housing program. That's the next order of business for the nation's home builders. The architecture of the houses in Levittown is varied enough to eliminate dreary monotony, while at the same time enough alike to permit the savings that result from standardization. Many housing projects are a sea of mud when it rains, but not this one. A wide range of color schemes also brings variety. So here's the home that cost its happy owners just $9,000. And that includes such extras as a completely equipped kitchen, a 2-way fireplace, a finished room in the attic, and even a washing machine. The living room. Levittown is a community of young people, and that means a great need for schools. Space has been set aside for plenty of them. Dotted here and there throughout the huge area are shopping centers where every type of product or service is readily available. shoe stores, five and dimes, department stores, supermarkets, and banks. In addition, there are other facilities designed to draw residents together to help make them feel they are part of a real community. Recreation centers with provisions for filling leisure hours, summer or winter. Yes, that old potato patch has come to a good end.